Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of September 11th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Making a List and Checking It Twice division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. And no, this is not a podcast about an early Christmas. As many of you know, long-suffering listeners of this podcast know, one of the things I love talking about on this podcast is books. Books, history, and sports are probably the trilogy of the things that we talk about here the most, interviewing authors about their books or just talking about things I've read that I've loved and wanted to share with you. You may have seen or heard about this story sometime this summer. Today I'm talking about Dan Pelzer and the list of books that he kept. Many people sent me email links about this story thinking I would be interested in it. I had already seen it myself. Dan Pelzer was a 92-year-old man who died on July 1st, 2025 in Columbus, Ohio. He was born in 1933, I think in Detroit. And Dan was like millions of other Americans. He worked across a long career. He had children, he had grandchildren, he was a practicing Catholic, but he also kept a list of books that he read from 1962 until 2023, when failing eyesight meant that he could no longer read. As 2023 drew to a close, he read his last book. But across 62 years inclusive, from 1962 to 2023, he faithfully recorded the title of every book that he read. Now, you know, last December and at the end of every year, I sort of recap what I've read. I keep a list. I've been keeping a list, detailed list of what I read. I've been doing it since 1997. So inclusive through this year, it'll be 28 years. I'll talk more about that later. So I was interested in this story. It caught my eye. Dan kept a list. He wrote it out most of the time. Some years he typed it. Now, how all this came to be in terms of the whole world knowing about it is when Dan died in July at the age of 92, one of the things that his kids wanted to do at his funeral was print his reading list. But it was really too long to do. It comes out to like 90, I think it's 98, 94. I've got it printed out right here, pages. And so they really couldn't do that for his funeral. They printed a sampling of it. But one of the things the family did is they started a website called What Dan Read. It's what-dan-read, READ.com, because there was so much interest. And this story just went viral. You wouldn't think it would, really. I mean, I wouldn't think there would be that much unusual about someone keeping a list of books they read. I don't know if it was the fact that he kept a list or the fact that he kept it for so long. Dan started this list when he was in the Peace Corps. He volunteered for the Peace Corps after it was created by John F. Kennedy. In 1962, Dan would have been about 29 years old. He was volunteering in Nepal, and he began keeping a list. He discovered that the Peace Corps had a library of about 350 paperback books. So he started reading. Presumably he read before his 29th year, but he kept a list, and he started writing it down. Now, pre-1966, he wasn't specific about what year he was reading these books. Starting in 1966, he wrote when he finished a book. So from there through 2023, we have a comprehensive list of not only what he read, but when he finished it. And I will just sum all of this up by saying that across 63 years, Dan Pelzer read 3,599 books. I don't know how many he read before that. Now, in pulling my calculator out, 3,599 divided by 62 is 58 books a year. Now, folks, that's a lot of books. That's more than a book a week for a guy who was working full time. Last year, 2024, I read 48 books and thought I had really done something. That's not quite a book a week. And I don't really know how I did that, because normally in my book list that I've kept since 1997, I think I've read 744 books, which comes out to roughly about 25 books a year, which is more in line with what I read. Dan Pelzer some years read many, many more than 58 books. There were some years he read 80 books. I don't really know how he did it. I would love to have had Dan on this podcast. I would have liked to have talked to him about how he read, what parts of the day he read, but I suspect there weren't many parts of the day he didn't read. Now it's really interesting. You think about somebody reading that much, you think, and I've had this conversation with some of my colleagues here at GHS. First of all, did he have a job? He did have a job, and I've read the obituary. He worked as let's see, according to the obituary that his children wrote, he his work experience included substituting as a social studies teacher on a TV show. It said, I don't know exactly what that means, working security at a nightclub. And from 1970 to his retirement in 2000, when he was 67 years old, he was a social worker for the Ohio Department of Youth Services. And his children say that he always had a book with him. He always had a book everywhere he went. And he read at home. They suspect he read on the job, which more power to you if you did, Dan. I think that's great. Here's the other interesting part about all of this. Most of these books, 3,599 books that he read across all those years, were checked out of the Whitehall branch of the Columbus Metropolitan Library. He apparently recoiled at the idea of purchasing a book. His son said, and I quote here, he would always sort of recoil if you spoke of potentially buying him a book. He would say, John, I can get that from the library, unquote. Now, there is where we differ. I love libraries. I think they are wonderful assets and are foundational to our democracy and the ongoing education of everyone in the fact that they disseminate information freely. And I encourage you to get a library card if you don't have one. But I myself, as you know, I've talked about this, have built a library, professional and otherwise, across many, many years. Dan Pelzer did not. So I don't know if that meant he probably did not write in these books. He probably didn't take notes about these books. I haven't really heard anything about whether he took notes or, if he took notes on something else, a pad of paper. He read at such a fast clip. I don't know that he would have slowed down for that. Now, lots of other interesting things here about this. As you know, there's a school of thought out there. Usually readers are divided into two camps. There's one camp of people who, once they start reading a book, they read every word and they read the entire book, no matter how much they don't like it, no matter how much it bores them, no matter how much they're dying. They finish the book once they start it. Other people, of course, believe that life is too short. If you're reading a book you don't like, you should put it down and move on to something else. I confess that I kind of fall in the first camp. Once I start something, particularly if it is a book I purchased, so I actually invested money in it, I feel like if I don't read it, I'm never going to read it. And then I want to give it away. And if it's something I was interested enough in to buy and purchase, if I find myself not being interested, I'll put it back on the shelf and I'll wait for another. It's just not the day for that book. I've done that with a lot of the classics, like War and Peace. Once I went into that, got into a few pages and thought, I'm not ready for this right now. And I backed out. And I went back to it later when I was ready. I think I've talked about this before on this podcast. It wasn't the high holy day for that book. I don't know what Dan Pelzer did. I do know that his children said he would read every word of every book. Once he started it, he read it. And he read some real dogs. They said that the one book he said across all of those years, the worst one, the one he hated, was Ulysses by James Joyce. He said it was absolute torture. If you've ever picked that book up and looked at it, you can understand why he felt that way. It's stream of consciousness. There's all kinds of things going on, literary devices in that book. It is not for the faint of heart. I've never tried to read it. I've certainly picked it up in bookstores and looked at it, tried to read a few pages. It's just not something that I have ever wanted to tackle. Maybe one day I will, but I feel like I could go through my whole life and not feel like I need to have read Ulysses. Well, he did. And I'm telling you, he read a lot more than that and tackled a lot of big books about some heavy subjects. I am amazed and fascinated at all the things he read. Now, there's several places that you can go on the web if you're interested. His list, as you might imagine, this has gone viral and it has inspired a lot of people to want to read more or to want to read books that he had on his list. I find it fascinating just to go through and just see what he read across so many different subjects. His children say that he was interested in everything, and his book list reflects that. I mean, there's so much in there. He read history, biography, fiction, nonfiction, philosophy, religion. While he was working as a social worker, he read a lot of books about things that would have what we would call now sort of professional interest about children and the problems, social and psychological that troubled children have. It's a fascinating look at for somebody who didn't keep a diary. This is sort of a way to really get insight into their life. Now, I mentioned whatdanread.com. The Columbus Metropolitan Library has put together an entire list, alphabetical by title, of all the books he read. And there's also a spreadsheet, so you could search it. It includes every title on the list, and you can search it, and you can find out when he read certain things. So there's all kinds of ways that you can come at this story. It appeared there was an article in the New York Times that was entitled, "He Read at Least 3,599 Books in His Lifetime. Now anyone can see his list." This was published on July 26, 2025. His children also said that he had a goal to read at least 100 pages a day. I think in looking at his list for some years, he had to have read far, far more than that. I don't know that he was speed reading. I think he just devoted a lot of hours to the day. The other questions that I've talked about with my colleagues: did he have a social life? Was he a guy who just went to work every day and then came home and squirreled himself away? No, he had an active social life. He was married. He had 2 children. He was an active Catholic, very involved in his local Catholic church. If you go to his obituary, and you know how you can write on the wall there, you can write tributes and notes and messages to the family. There's several things there written by nephews and nieces for whom he acted as almost a second father. They talk about Uncle Dan. He seems to have been a genuinely wonderful fella, somebody that you would have liked to have known as a friend or a neighbor. He just loved to read books, among many other things. It said during his retirement, he volunteered a few days each week at the St. Lawrence Haven Meal Program. He volunteered at the downtown YWCA and was a towel boy. He spent time playing chess, reading, pursuing spiritual activities. So it sounded like he had a very full life, doing things that he loved to do, including reading. And he wrote down what he read. And I got to tell you, as someone who devotes a good bit of time myself, but not that much time, about an hour and a half every day reading, I am astonished at the number of books that he read. I'm astonished at the titles that he was able to read, the Catholicity, no pun intended, of the subjects that he was able to cover. One of the things that we have in common is he read Watership Down to his children. And you know, if you've listened to this podcast, I love that book. I've read it several times. First discovered it in 1981 as a junior in high school. Mrs. Hewitt's class at South Gwinnett High School. Read it again a couple of years later, and then 40 years later, I read it again last year, and it was every bit as good as I remembered it. That was one of the books on his list. I think I failed to mention Dan was a Marine. He was a Korean War veteran. He received a bachelor's in education and a master's in political science from the University of Detroit. So what did Dan read? Well, I'll walk through the list in just a minute. I am not going to read every title to you, but it is really, I'll bring a few to your attention here. These are things, some of which I have an interest in reading, have not done so for the most part. One of the first things I noticed is that he read the Hornblower series. Horatio Hornblower by C.S. Forester. I actually wrote about those in my blog several years ago. I've read three of those books. I think he read almost all of them. He read a book called Inquisition of the Middle Ages. This was written by Henry Charles Leah in 1888. It's a multi-volume set. I'm not sure if he read every volume in the series or if he just read one book, but he read it. That's what first got my attention, that this guy was a serious reader. He read a book called The Universe and Dr. Einstein, written by Lincoln Barnett, published in 1948. This was an enormously popular and influential paperback that throughout the 1950s, a lot of people read as a way to sort of wrap their minds around this new nuclear science that was out there, trying to understand how all that worked. He read that book. The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Not an easy read by any means. He read that. And this is when I first began to, this next, I thought, okay, this is a guy who's serious about this. I have on my shelf here, just feet away from me right now, Winston Churchill's 6-volume History of the Second World War. A lot of people have these books. You have seen them in every secondhand bookstore in America has at least one, if not all 6 volumes. Very few people have actually read these books. They sit on their shelves. They look good. He read all 6 volumes in about a month in March and April 1967. And between volumes 5 and 6, he read Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, which is another of my favorite of the great books. And it's like it's just tucked in there like, oh, yeah, maybe volume 6 wasn't immediately available at the local library there, so he decided to read Thackeray in between. This one got my attention because if you've heard me say this on this podcast, every year this is one of those books I say, this is the year I'm going to read it, and every year passes and I don't. He read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in August and September of 1968. He seemed to have read a 3-volume set. Sometimes those come in 6 volumes. He read those. Now, here's the other thing. In 1985, he decided to launch off and read The Great Books of the Western World. That's a series that was put out by the Encyclopedia Britannica in 50-some-odd volumes. He reread in that series The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1985. So he not only read it once, he read it twice. More on that reading twice in a minute. Arnold Toynbee, an enormously popular historian, British trained, who wrote in the 20th century. He wrote a multi-volume study called A Study of History. It was widely bought. You also see the volumes in this series at a lot of secondhand bookstores. He read 2 volumes, probably a 2-volume condensation of Toynbee's Study of History in June and July 1970. And then in 1988 and 89, over about 6 months, he read all 10 volumes of Toynbee. I've never seen anyone, never met anyone who could say they read all 10 volumes of Toynbee. And this is just one of many things like this on his list. I don't know what he retained of what he read. If you read, you know that one of the things we all struggle with when you read a lot is retaining. I mean, I've pulled books down off my shelf and thought I'd like to read this and realized that I've already read it maybe 10, 12 years ago, and I don't remember anything about it. It's the curse of the reader. If you're a reader who can remember everything that you read, more power to you. So he read all 10 volumes of Toynbee. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, of course, very popular. He read all 3 of those volumes over Christmas and New Year's from 1970 and 71. Probably had a few days off. Now, something happened in the second half of 1971. Don't know what it is. Maybe his kids know, but he didn't finish a book between July 5th, 1971 and January 2nd, 1972. For 6 months, he didn't read anything, or at least he did not record that he read anything. So I don't know if it was just a lapse in writing things down or if something happened in his life that kept him so occupied. Maybe it was a job, maybe it was a health crisis. I don't think either of his kids were born at that point, but something kept him from reading in the second half of 1971. And in studying his list, it's the only time that I can find that that was true. He seems to have always read. Don't know, too. I think he read multiple books at one time, and probably because they were in different genres. He might have read a mystery, and then he might have read some nonfiction, because there are some years, many years, in which he records a title with the same, I'm guessing, finish date. For instance, Christmas Day, he finished 2 books one year. other years the similar. So I'm guessing that he probably had multiple books going at one time. He probably had one that he could take with him as if he had to go sit in a doctor's office that wasn't, for instance, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He read Gordon Wood's Creation of the American Republic, which was published in 1969, a seminal work on the American Revolution. This one got my attention. Will Durant. You've seen these books in any secondhand bookstore in America. The Story of Civilization. This was published between 1930 something and 1970. 11 volumes. It begins with a book called Our Oriental Heritage. I've read that one, and I've read the second volume about the Greeks. He read all 11 volumes in the calendar year 1981. Now, if that was all he read in 1981, it would be a seminal achievement. It was those 11 books were one of, 11 of, I don't know how many he read, but he read all, and they are big, thick doorstops. These are books you do not want to drop on your foot. He read all 11 volumes of Durant's Story of Civilization. Now, here's the one that really got me. Great Books of the Western World. These were first published by Encyclopedia Britannica in the early 1950s. They were revised and then pushed out to about 60 volumes around 1990 or 91. Over a 5-year period between 1982 and 1987, Dan Pelzer read at least 53 volumes of the Great Books of the Western World. These books are published usually in double column. They start with Homer, and they go all the way through to literature that was published in the mid-20th century. He even read the volumes that nobody ever even opens, the ones on mathematics. He read, from what I can tell, Christian Huygens. He read Principia Mathematica by Isaac Newton. Some of the stuff is, you open them up and it's just impenetrable. I don't know if his eyes just glazed over it, but there it is on his reading list that the man sat down and grappled with and read 53 volumes of Great Books of the Western World, which included Montaigne's essays. It included Samuel Johnson, or I should say James Boswell's Life of Johnson. It included Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He read all this stuff as part of that series over a 5-year period. He read an 8-volume set of something called The History of Philosophy by Frederick Copleston. I'm not familiar with this, but he read all 8 volumes in 1987. He read widely in religion and theology and philosophy. And of course, one of the books having to do with all of those that's not on his list is the Bible. And according to his kids, he read it dozens of times throughout his life. In fact, there's a passage here in his obituary that I thought was worth quoting. Not in the obituary, but in talking about in the New York Times story. Missing from Mr. Pelzer's list of books was the Bible, even though he had read it about a dozen times, his son said. Mr. Pelzer was a devout Catholic who left the Jesuit seminary for the Peace Corps. Now, his son John, who's now 51, recalled, "My friends from high school would always laugh. When they visited, he would always be reading in our basement, typically the Bible, and he would be drinking a 40-ounce malt liquor, typically Old English. It was a contradiction in Mr. Pelzer's life, he said, and life was full of them. He was an enigma wrapped in a riddle." So the guy was reading the Bible and drinking beer at the same time. But he, again, read a lot of philosophy, a lot of religion. Now, I mentioned, okay, so he read history of philosophy. He began reading books that were published in a series called the New American Nation series. These were a series of books that were published by Harper, by experts in the field in all aspects of American history, starting, of course, with the Spanish conquistadors, the indigenous population, coming forward all the way into the 20th century. He read numerous volumes in that series in 1988. Also in 1988, one of the biggest and most popular books that year was Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. There it was on Dan Pelzer's list. He read it in 1988 and again 4 years later in 1992. Now, this brings me to a point. There were several books that Dan reread on his list. I don't know if it was because he was so interested in it that he wanted to read it again, or if, like a lot of us, he simply forgot that he ever read it in the first place. His list was either typewritten or written out. So it wasn't, so far as we know, obviously in the early, up until the early 90s, wasn't even, you couldn't have written it on a computer and something searchable. So he couldn't search the list unless he just went through it to see what he'd read before. I'll come back to this, but particularly in his later years, as I'm guessing his memory probably began to fail him a little bit. And I don't mean to say he had Alzheimer's or dementia. I don't know that he did, but you see books that are reread. Um, and there's one famous instance where his daughter asked him about a book and he didn't, and I'll get to that in a minute too. So he read Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers when it came out in 1988. In 2005, he tackled Marcel Proust, right? This is speaking of books that are can be somewhat not just intimidating but impenetrable, not like William Faulkner, which by the way, he read a good bit of Faulkner that's on here too. But he read 3 volumes of Proust. I don't know if he just didn't want to finish. It's like 7 volumes of Proust, but he read the first 3 in 2005. So I was interested. This is, of course, Remembrance of Things Past, or In Search of Lost Time, as it's now known. The American President series that began to appear in the early 21st century, covering George Washington all the way through. I think the last volume published was George W. Bush. He read almost every one of those books in 2011, probably as they became available in his library. I have every one of those books right here on my shelf. I've read about 3 of them. He read all of them that had been published in 2011. You've probably seen titles in the Oxford History of the United States, starting with Robert Middlecoff's Glorious Cause, which he read at least twice. This is the one, Battle Cry of Freedom. James McPherson about the Civil War, all the way down to books published in the last couple of years. He read just about all of the books published in the Oxford History of the U.S. series. And I was wondering if he read a good bit of Russian history, I noticed, and I thought, well, I don't see any books on here by Robert Massey, who was the very popular historian who wrote biographies of Catherine the Great and a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Peter the Great. Yep, in 2012, he read all of Robert Massey's books on Russia. Now, I could go through and tell you about other titles that he wrote. He read a lot of mystery, a lot of fiction, both classic fiction and popular fiction as books came out. He read memoir. He read biography. As I mentioned, he read philosophy, religion. He read a good bit about the Catholic Church and the Jesuits, of which he had trained as one. But again, he left the seminary. He read Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, A Stillness at Appomattox, Bruce Catton. I'm just going to randomly look at some titles that I had noticed that he read. He was a fan of Arthur Conan Doyle. He read all of Doyle, including The Hound of the Baskervilles. He read Three Who Made a Revolution, which is also about Russia, by Bertram Wolfe. He read Ivanhoe by Walter Scott. Lots of books on the Russian Revolution. He read Barbara Tuchman. From what I can gather, he seems to have written just about everything that she published. The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. C.V. Wedgwood's The 30 Years' War. He read Moby Dick twice. Talk about a glutton for punishment. I know there's Moby Dick fans out there listening to this book, but I got to tell you, that's one book. That would be my Ulysses. I read that, did not enjoy it, probably would never read it again. He read that twice. He read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. Edward Gibbon, as I mentioned, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of the Scientific Revolutions. I have that book on my shelf. Want to read it, but haven't. Well, he read it. V.O. Key Jr.'s 1948 classic, Southern Politics in State and Nation. This is the other thing. Dan Pelzer, according to his children, was a lifelong liberal. You might imagine he would have been early on because he joined the Peace Corps, again, a fan of John F. Kennedy's. But one of the things that I noticed in his reading list is he didn't just read about things that he would have agreed with. As we get into the Trump years, for instance, he's reading books about Donald Trump and about his followers and about the conservative movement, probably to try to understand what was going on. So kudos to him for reading outside of things that he probably didn't agree with, but wanted to understand. I mentioned that he read The Hobbit. He read James Frazier's classic, The Golden Bough, which is a study of cultures and religions through time. I mentioned that he read Toynbee and J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He read The Boys of Summer, the great book about baseball that Roger Kahn wrote. He read that book in 1976. Gay Talese's classic book about the New York Times, The Kingdom and the Power. He read that in October 1977. Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy. Again, not an easy book to read. Matthew Josephson's classic book, The Robber Barons. Read that in 1978. Big fan of John Keegan's. He read a lot of military history as well. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, which is a classic. He read that in 1979. Again, just sort of randomly going through. He read science fiction. He read John Jakes. Apparently, he loved John Jakes. And between June 1981 and August of 1981, I count that he read 8 John Jakes books in about 6 weeks of 1981, which, oh, by the way, was the year he was reading The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant, which is just incredible. He started reading the great books of the Western world in 1982, and those included everything from the Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes. He read Aristotle, Rabelais, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Shakespeare, Swift, Sterne, Francis Bacon. I mean, this is no joke. It's a serious, serious reading list. And he, over a 5-year period, he seemed to have worked his way through chronologically through over 50 volumes in that series. He read a series called The Life of Jesus Christ and Biblical Revelations that went on for 4 volumes. Read that in August and September 1986. Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time. Gorbachev's book, Perestroika, that he read in 1988. Daniel Boorstin, you remember his great trilogy, The Discoverers, The Explorers. He read The Discoverers in 1988. I mentioned he was reading in the New American Nation series. I'll give you a sampling of those. Charles Gibson's Spain and America. He read a book called Founding the American Colonies. The Norse Voyages by David Beers Quinn, which is a classic. Got most of these on my shelf. Have I read them? I have not, but I have them. I mentioned Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and then Toynbee's 10 volumes, which is just astonishing. I mean, he also read a book called Pornography in a Free Society by Gordon Hawkins in 1990. The Case Against Divorce. He read The Ethics of Abortion, Pro-Life versus Pro-Choice by Robert Baird. These are the kind of things I mentioned that he probably read that had to do with his job as a way to sort of just educate himself about some of the sociological issues going on in the world. Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. Frank Herbert's Dune, science fiction, as I mentioned. Thomas Friedman's From Beirut to Jerusalem, one of the best books written about the Middle Eastern conflict. Josephine Tey, one of my favorite mystery writers. He worked her in there as well. David McCulloch's books are here. Truman, John Adams. He read Presidential Biography. He read Simon Schama's Citizens, A Chronicle of the French Revolution twice. First read it in 1993, and then about 20 years later, he read it again. I don't know if he forgot that he read it one time or if he enjoyed it so much he wanted to read it again. David Remnick's Pulitzer Prize-winning Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Empire. He read in 1993. History of the Arab Peoples by Albert Hurani. Carlo D'Esti's Decision in Normandy. The 50s by David Halberstam, which is a book I've read twice. That is a wonderful book. Martin Gilbert's The First World War, A Complete History. Again, that is not a book for amateurs. That is a big, thick, heavy book. John Hale's Civilization of Europe in the Renaissance, which is a great book. Christopher Lash's Revolt of the Elites, How the Irish Saved Civilization, which is written by Thomas Cahill, first book in his sort of history of civilization that he wrote. Just so many books like this. John Barrett's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil is on here. Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. Sebastian Junger's The Perfect Storm. Hitler's Willing Executioners by Daniel Goldhagen. The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang. James Joyce, Ulysses, which he struggled with in 1998. He also read Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man later that year. Catch 22 by Joseph Heller. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. Samuel Butler's The Way of All Flesh. I, Claudius. All of these great works of literature that he read. Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods. Dash Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Tobacco Road by Erskine Caldwell. And on and on and on. To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, there's hardly a work you can think of. Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. Beloved by Toni Morrison. The Manchurian Candidate. Blood Meridian. Cormac McCarthy's books are here. Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House. Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. Fahrenheit 451. Aerosmith by Sinclair Lewis. It's just astounding. Biographies of Benjamin Franklin by Walter Isaacson. Mentioned that he read Proust in 2005. Looks like he read the first 3 volumes of Remembrance of Things Past. I don't know if he couldn't get the other volumes or if he just gave up after those 3. I wouldn't blame him. I read the first volume and I can't bring myself to tackle the second one. Here's Collapse by Jared Diamond. How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. David McCulloch's 1776. Elie Wiesel's Night. John Lewis Gaddis, History of the Cold War. Barack Obama, The Audacity of Hope and Dreams from My Father, both on here. John Ferling, an author that I love and that I've had on here many times. Almost a Miracle, The American Victory in the War of Independence, as I mentioned, probably the best military history of the Revolution. Marcus Rediker's volume, The Slave Ship. The Catholicity of things that he was interested in. Reading all of this across a lifetime. Richard Evans' trilogy about the Third Reich is on here that he read in 2010. Sax Rohmer's The Mystery of Dr. Fu Manchu is on here. Sarah Bakewell's How to Live or a Life of Montaigne. Wolf Hall is on here. I mentioned all of those biographies of presidents in that series. Now, you've heard me talk about I want to read The Power Broker, that gigantic book written by Robert Caro. Wondered if it was on here, and it is. I finally found it as I read through chronologically. Let's see. I want to find it here in the spreadsheet. August 15th, 2020, he read The Power Broker. Now, by then, of course, he was in his late 80s. And his daughter read that book and asked him, Dad, how did you like it? And he said, I've never read it. Well, there it was on his list. So by the time we get around 2020, you see books that he'd either read not too long before. So I don't know if he just forgot that he read it or if it made no impression on him. It's hard to believe he could have pushed his way through The Power Broker and not remembered that he read it, but he didn't. There it is. He read Tom Wolfe's A Man in Full, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert. He read a lot of these books where he was studying philosophers. Wittgenstein in 90 minutes, Schopenhauer, Socrates in 90 minutes. H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. I've read that. Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, which was published not long ago. Many books, as I mentioned, that he read twice. Several of these were in the New American Nation series that he read twice. Again, I just don't know if he enjoyed them that much or if he forgot that he read them. And again, there's nothing wrong with that if that happened. That happens to all of us. I could go on and on and on, but what I will say is the last book, as his eyesight began to fail him, and I'm telling you as a reader, there's just nothing worse than the idea that your eyes are going to fail you and that they're going to stop working before you do and before the rest of your body gives out. But in 2023, in December, and I want to get it right, the last book that he recorded in his long reading list that he finished on December 30th, 2023 was David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. And that is a very fitting way to end a reading life. I guess if you were going to choose one book to go out on, Copperfield by Dickens, you could do a lot worse. And I'm not sure that he had ever read that book before. So even if it was a reread, um, that's okay. Charles Dickens' David Copperfield is the last book on this list. If you love to read, if you love books, if you need inspiration, because I'll tell you, he's inspired me. And you might ask, well, in what way? I read, I think, as much as I possibly can now. I don't know that my life needs more reading in it than I'm doing already. I don't want to shortchange or read faster, but I'm not going to let the size of a book or the length of a book keep me from tackling it. I look at this list and I think if Dan Pelzer was interested in it, he picked it up, he checked it out of the library, and he read it. Sometimes he read it twice, either on purpose or because he forgot. But either way, it is a remarkable testament to a man who loved books. For any of us and all of us who love books and who love reading, this book is an inspiration. So I encourage you to go to What Dan Read. That's what-dan-read.com and check it out. Go to the Columbus Library and see the things they have up. They have his list there, and they tell you if his books are available in the library where he found them. And as I mentioned at his funeral and in his obituary, his children wanted to include his reading list, and it was really too long, so they had a sampling. But they say at the end of the obituary, in lieu of flowers, donations to the Kinship Community Food Center, which was one of Dan's passions, those would be appreciated. But then the very last sentence of the obituary, you could also honor Dan by reading a real, quote, page turner. Read a book in honor of Dan Pelzer. What a remarkable life and a remarkable man. As one of the people who wrote on the wall of his obituary at the funeral home site, he was a maestro in the art of living. I'm sorry I didn't know Dan Pelzer, but I'm going to try to get to know him a little bit better by spending some time in his reading list and in some of the books that he clearly loved. One other death of note that I want to bring to your attention this week. I noticed this in the New York Times obituary as well, which I read daily. This is a fellow named Gene Espy, E-S-P-Y, which is a Georgia name. And sure enough, he was a Georgian. This caught my attention. Gene Espy was the second person to through hike the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine in 1951, which was 3 years after Earl Schaeffer, or Schaffer, I've never known how exactly he pronounced his name, did it in 1948. Gene Espy, at 24 years old, hiked from Georgia to Maine. He, as I mentioned, he did it in 123 days. He hiked 2,025 miles through 14 states. He started on May 31st, 1951, which was late. It would be late these days to start a through hike. Most through hikers now are taking off in North Georgia in February and March. At that time, he hiked the southern terminus of the trail was Mount Oglethorpe in Pickens County. But because of development around that area, in 1958, 21 years after it had been established, the Appalachian Trail moved the southern terminus 13 miles northeast to Springer Mountain. But he hiked from Mount Oglethorpe in Pickens County to Maine. And he did it, as I mentioned, in 123 days. He finished on the last day of September in 1951, averaging about 16 miles a day, but sometimes walked more than 30. And he remained active in the hiking community in Georgia throughout his life. There was a great photograph of him standing at the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. He lost 28 pounds and grew a thick red beard over the 4 months that he was hiking. And you have to remember, in 1951, this was not the cultural phenomenon that it is now to thru hike. There were many places in which the trail, even though it was blazed, that there was thick undergrowth. I'm quoting from his obituary here in the New York Times. He grew a thick red beard. He bushwhacked his way through thick undergrowth. He waded through ponds built by beavers and killed about 15 rattlesnakes. He woke up one night to see that a raccoon had opened a container of dehydrated milk and was licking it as it dripped out. He slept atop a 55-foot fire tower one evening to escape being attacked by howling wildcats. Eugene Marion Espy was born in Cordial, Georgia on April 14th, 1927. He remained active in the hiking community throughout his life. When he finished his hike, by the way, he hitchhiked to Boston and spent $100 on new clothes and a bus ticket back to Georgia. He was beloved in the hiking community till the end of his life and died on August 22nd, 2025 in Atlanta. Gene Espy was 98 years old. So think about him. The next time you get out there on that trail, the second person who ever hiked it was a Georgian who just recently died. Thank you for tuning in today to this podcast, listening to me talk about Dan Pelzer and his reading list, which I hope you found and will find inspiring as I have and will continue to do. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll come back. We've got some, I hope, very interesting podcasts lined up for you in this season. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, currently recovering from knee surgery after his successful summer tour with the GHS shin kicking team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most appreciated and helpful. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar podcasts about history and books and the authors who write them, like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.